The world is experiencing its worst economic conditions in nearly a century. The coronavirus pandemic has forced economies to shut down for months, and even as they've reopened, consumer spending is down sharply, as is international trade. The International Monetary Fund says the livelihoods of millions of people are at risk.
The cumulative loss in output, for instance, relative to the pre-pandemic projected path, will grow from 11 trillion over this year and next to 28 trillion by end 2025. Now, this represents a severe setback to improvements in average living standards pretty much everywhere in the world.
Besides spending on more healthcare, governments are also having to spend more on boosting their economies. Stimulus measures worth $8 trillion have been passed since the onset of the pandemic. That's expected to drive up global debt to 100% of GDP. Yet the IMF is urging governments to offer more than just cash handouts. It's signaling an overhaul in economic policies.
A crisis is an opportunity. Our research shows that public investment, especially in green projects and digital infrastructure, can be a game changer, with the potential to create millions of new jobs, well-paying jobs, while boosting productivity, raising incomes.
It's also calling on governments to support environmentally conscious businesses and continue implementing lockdowns and other restrictions until the COVID-19 pandemic is wiped out. But many emerging economies will have to borrow even more money to do so. And unless their ability to repay what they've borrowed improves, a debt crisis could worsen the ordeal for billions of people. Mobin Nasir, TRT World.
Well, for more on this, Richard Wolff joins us now from New York. He's Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Massachusetts and the founder of Democracy at Work. Welcome back to the program, Professor. Now, the coronavirus pandemic, as we know, is shaping up to be the greatest peacetime economic disruption in living memory, and sadly, it isn't over just yet. But what key lessons have we learned so far in terms of how governments should be responding to the economic impact of this health crisis?
Well, I think the best way to answer, as usual, is with history. The entirety of the 20th century was in many ways a reaction to the Great Depression of the 1930s. And much of the coming century that we're living in will be a response to, a coping with the after effects of this catastrophe we are living through now. The first thing that's happening, and you can hear it from the IMF, is that there's a reassessment of the neoliberal ideology, the notion that the government was a burden and the private sector was the magic road to prosperity. The private sector wasn't ready for this virus. It should have been. It hasn't been able to contain it. It should have. And it is allowing an economic business cycle to happen on top of it. It is way too much for this system to manage, and everybody is slowly understanding it. We're going to see much more government, much less of reliance on the private. And we're going to have an even deeper question about the capacity of capitalism as a system to keep the loyalty of people when it has performed so badly, except for the richest at the top.
Well, as you say, after crises in the past, we've often seen some drastic changes to how governments run their countries, help their citizens. For example, you mentioned the Great Depression, but also after the Second World War, that pretty much cemented support for the welfare state. After the more recent 2008 financial crisis, we saw more support for tighter regulations on the banking system. Is there anything specific that you can think of that we might see as a result of this pandemic when it finishes?
Yes, I can give you statistics from the United States, but they're generalizable. We currently have 26 million people collecting unemployment insurance. We have over half of our basic adult capable, healthy population without work and without the ability to find work if you do the statistics properly. You're going to have to take care of these people in a welfare state multiplied, or else you're going to have civil unrest, the signs of which are already there in anti-immigrant behavior, in racial troubles. We have a boiling pot of trouble that has to be addressed that the private sector has not been able to. And that's going to be the major immediate demand for an adjustment to the way we live.
Now, the IMF, as we know, isn't an activist organization by any means, but they're sounding increasingly radical, aren't they, relative to how they've been in the past? I mean, they're basically saying that high borrowing isn't a bad thing for governments around the world. It's calling for more action on climate change, saying it'll be better for the economies in the shorter term and the longer term. It's also saying that countries that didn't lock down earlier when they were supposed to are going to be hit harder in the long run when it comes to the coronavirus. Why do you think the IMF is taking a bit of an activist tone, more so than what they're used to?
I think it's a reaction to what we have seen in the last 7 months in those societies, which are, run from the People's Republic of China to New Zealand to South Korea to Germany. Those countries where the government has been able to mobilize both public and private support to really go after the pandemic and to go after the economic crisis have done much better than, for example, the United States, the United Kingdom, and so on, which tend to leave it to the private. No one is missing the difference in the performances there, and you're seeing the undermining of what we call the neoliberal consensus since Reagan and Thatcher. It is being replaced by a recognition that the government has to be brought in, if only to try to save capitalism from itself.
Okay, well, let's see if that results in any significant reforms when this is all over. Professor Richard Wolff, thank you again for joining us from New York.